As a photographer, everything in your life will come and go. The subjects you prioritize, the stories you aim to tell, the photos you love the most and those that fall behind, everything has a lifespan. In the end, photography is a very lonely activity. No matter how much you want to rely on others, it ultimately falls upon you to be the creative force. It falls upon you to tell the stories, and the only partner there for the whole experience, from the day you first start to the day you take your last photo, is the camera. It's therefore paramount for us to build a relationship founded on trust with our cameras. And the best way to do so is to set up your camera such that it speaks the same language you do. Today, I want to talk about what I believe to be a true artist's camera, the Fujifilm X-T5. Like most modern cameras, the Fujifilm is still marred with the same complexities that can feel as though they get between us and the stories we are trying to tell, but it only takes a few tweaks to make this an artist's tool that simply gets out of the way. In this video, I'll focus on how I set this camera up to be as effective as possible for my photographic approach. I have set up the Fujifilm based on my own style, a style that is rooted in mobility, in bad weather, in rarely using a tripod, and in often having the camera in one hand. Therefore, this setting and this configuration is built to suit me, and it's built to suit the environments that I work in. All this is to say that these settings in totality may not be applicable to you, and I encourage you to take what's useful. If you try to take everything full stop, copy and paste it into your camera, it may suit you, but it may not, and I encourage you to play around. By playing around, I've gotten to a position where I feel comfortable with my camera, and it's more like an extension than it is a tool that I have to consider moment to moment. So, I hope this is useful. I hope you pull everything useful out of it for yourself, and if none of it's useful to you, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. I'm happy to argue with you about my settings. Just know that they work for me. Now, if you do decide that you don't want to use the dials on the top of the camera for whatever reason it is, it's quite easy to turn them off and reprogram them to the front and back function wheels. Starting with ISO on the left side, you simply turn the wheel to C and then click that lock button so that you don't accidentally change it while you're shooting. This will reprogram the ISO towards your index finger wheel. So this is going to be the front function wheel. You can then control it from there. Moving to the right, you have the shutter speed dial, and in this case, you turn it to T. And again, make sure to lock that dial so that you don't accidentally change it while shooting. This reprograms that dial to your thumb, and you can now operate both the shutter speed and the ISO with just your thumb and index finger. For me, shooting one-handed, this is the only way to use the camera. When I'm able to shoot two-handed or when everything is moving quite slow, I can leave it on the dials and use two hands. So as we dive into the function buttons, I want to present a bit of a motto. Less is more. When we configure every one of these buttons, we give ourselves a new choice to make. So if everything is configured, if there's all these different ways we can approach a photograph via all these different buttons, it presents us with a multitude of choices that distract us from the actual process, the actual image in front of us. At least this is how I feel. So I do not configure every button, and quite frankly, I only use a few of them. Less is more. I want to begin with a little button that many people won't even see on the very front of the camera. This one right by where the lens meets the camera is my first function button of choice, and I have this set to the internal teleconverter. This is an electronic teleconverter that goes from no teleconversion to 1.4 to 2 times, and this is just a crop. So in this case, I only ever bring it to the 1.4 crop where I feel that the 40 megapixels on the X-T5 stands up just fine. Moving to the top of the camera, there's only one button of note, and this is in the very top right next to the on/off button. This little recessed button that can actually be quite hard to click, I have this set to face recognition. So it allows me to easily to tell the camera whether it should be recognizing a face or not. When I'm going between landscape and adventure work, a skier with a face, or a big cluster of trees, I'm able to easily turn this on and off so that the camera knows what to prioritize. Now, moving to the back of the camera, this is where there are all kinds of different ways you can go about this, and where I want to remind you, less is more. First, the AF on button, the single most used button on my camera. This allows me to back button focus, and I left it exactly as it was when the camera was delivered to me. I do not use auto exposure lock, so this button really just never gets used. Moving down, the joystick simply moves the focus point around, and if I click it, it resets it to center. I often find myself wanting to reset my focus, so this is a good way to expedite that process. And then the D-pad is where we have, again, the most choices, left, right, up, and down. I only use the left and the down because I don't want to have too many options. The left turns on the electronic level or turns it off. I like to have this sometimes, I don't like to have it other times. There's not a great rhyme or reason for that, but when it's annoying me and it's in the way, I am able to turn it off very quickly. The down button just brings me to my playback button. So if I click down, it brings up the last images I shot. Now there is a playback button already on the camera, but as I've said, I like to prioritize being able to use the full camera with one hand, and that button cannot be reached with one hand. And lastly, I have two functions that are configured such that they only work in certain shooting scenarios. The first is the rear control wheel, which is set to punch in, zoom in as much as possible, only while I'm in manual focus. And this, in conjunction with focus peaking, which I'll discuss when I get into the menus, allows me to really accurately tell if my photos are in focus or not when I'm manually focusing. The second button is up on the D-pad, and this button only works when I am in video mode, or when I've flicked the trigger to movie. When I'm in movie mode and I click up on the D-pad, I've had it set so that I get a log view assist. This is super useful for video shooters because it gives you an idea of what your image will look like once it's been edited. Otherwise, there's nothing else configured. The touchscreen has the option to be configured for up, swipe, down, left, or right. I find that incredibly annoying in the shooting process, so I turn those all off and I will never use them. They're completely useless to me. Now we get to the Q menu, which is like the home base for a selection of settings. These are the settings, for me, that I don't want to go digging around in the camera for, but do come up often enough that I want easy access to them. However, like the rest of the camera, I try to set up the Q menu as simply as possible, limiting the total selection to 8, and really you only get to choose 7 of those. The first option is the autofocus mode, and I'll talk more about autofocus in just a little bit. This is something that I'm going to change more often than the other settings in the Q menu, so it's the first one on the menu. Then there is the shutter type, and this is electronic or mechanical, or some combination of both. To be quite frank, I don't change this hardly ever, but if there's animals around, if it's an event, or if I'm on the streets and I don't want to draw attention to myself, then it's nice to be able to go to electronic shutter quite quickly. That can kind of keep the focus off of you. Then I have my white balance, and this is going to be something I change more often than most settings, but still not all that often. Typically I leave white balance in auto anyway, but it's here if I want to change it. Then we have a self-timer. Now this is another one I don't use all that often, but if I'm doing slow shutter speeds, for instance with astrophotography, or in just a dark scene where I'm getting down below half a second, there is some shake introduced when you click the shutter button. So I like to do a self-timer of about 2 seconds, which allows the camera to settle and then the photo to be taken. Then I have the film profiles button. And this is another one I don't change all that often, but it does come up. You know, typically I'm shooting in Provia Standard, but sometimes to get a visualization as I'm thinking about how an edit might turn out, I might turn it to ASCII Soft or Velvia Vivid. These are just options. Sometimes monochrome is used just to kind of help me get rid of distractions. But while I don't change it often, I like to have easy and quick access to it. Then we have the subject recognition button. This is another one that doesn't get changed all that often. This is a theme through all of these. That's why they're not function buttons and instead they're in the Q menu. But with the subject detection, this is really only going to be used if there's animals. I might switch it to animals if that's what I want to focus on. Otherwise, it's almost always going to stay in auto. And then last, there's manual focus assist, and this just allows me to create a highlight pattern that allows me to focus more precisely when I'm using manual focus lenses. So combining this with that digital teleconverter, I'll zoom in, dial my focus until I see the highlights from the manual focus assist, and then pull back out and take the shot. This is a good workflow for using manual focus lenses and making sure I hit things sharply. The theme with the Q menu is items I don't need all the time, but items I do want access to. And the broad menu system in the Fuji can get quite complicated and cluttered. I hate digging around through that to find things when I'm in the moment, so I make sure these are easily accessible for me. That is how I set up the Q menu. Rather than go through everything in the menu, which is tedious and largely unproductive for us today, I'm only going to talk about a few items that I find most important. The first one is the autofocus mode, and I already brought this up in the Q menu because I believe it's important. In truth, I leave this almost entirely on wide/tracking because that allows me to find the subject, put it into the single point, lock focus on it, and reframe as necessary. This works great for me, and I rarely find any reason to change it. Now, if I want to simplify what the camera has to do for me, I sometimes put it into zone. This is usually in a more landscape setting. Single point might work for this as well, but I'm always 99% of the time using zone or wide/tracking, and more often than not, it's wide/tracking. Then there is the wrap focus point. And what this means is that when you move the little joystick and say you get to the bottom of all your autofocus points, if you go one more, then it wraps around to the top. It just makes getting the autofocus point to where you want it a little bit faster. So I like to have that set to enable. I also want to make sure pre-autofocus is off, because if it's on, the camera is always trying to find focus, and that is not something I want. I want to tell it what to do, not let it choose for itself. Moving to the next setting is autofocus plus manual focus. I want this to be on because what it does is basically allow you to click the back button focus, and that then enables the focus ring on your lens. So as long as you're holding it, you can actually manual focus as well. It means you can choose between autofocusing and manual focusing. For certain settings like reflections, puddles, ice, or when there's distracting elements in the foreground, most often that's the case that I use this for, you can manual focus past that point, bypass the autofocus. It just gives you more control over your focusing. And the last few items are some of the simpler ones. I am always shooting in RAW because I want plenty of data for the editing process, but I do compress to lossless compressed. I do not find any image degradation by using this, and it does free up a lot more space in order to take more photos. It means I need to own less SD cards, and all around my file management is much easier as a result. And lastly, I always have IBIS/optical image stabilization turned on. I want that. I shoot handheld 99% of the time. It is a huge saver for me, so make sure IBIS is on. And so to wrap all of this up, there is one clear theme. Less is more. I have set everything up such that what I need is accessible, and it's accessible with one hand. This allows me to go through my shooting process in any environment and feel like I can capture what I need to capture. I don't want to be digging around, and I don't want too many choices to make. I know what's important to me and what's important in my process, so I put that front and center. Anything else as it arises, I'll find in the menu if I need to. And if a tool becomes more and more important to me, I'll add it to a function button or put it in the queue menu. But as of right now, what you saw is how I use my camera. And with that, that's all. If you have any questions, just toss them in the comments below. I am here to help.